We good? Okay. So what we're going to do tonight, we're going to talk a little bit about some of the traditions, holiday traditions that relate to things that are happening in December. And we'll talk a little bit about some of the history behind it, some of the forgotten stories that go along with it. And some of these are really interesting. Some of them are a bit frightening. And some of them are just downright amazing. And we'll talk about these as we go along. If you have any questions, please feel free to ask, probably towards the end, so I don't talk on forever. But I'll try to keep it as brief as I can. There is a lot to cover, so I want to kind of give us a fun evening tonight. And feel free, when we're done tonight, you can add to our little what's your favorite tradition board over here. Please write down what's your favorite tradition for the December holidays. And we'll also, if you're interested in tonight's presentation, I can also send you a copy of my PowerPoint, and you can take a look for it yourself. We're also going to be broadcasting this talk online. Luckily, if you want to be included on it, you can. But you can also listen to this at a later date if I'm talking a little too fast tonight. All right. So, odd holiday traditions and forgotten stories. First things first. There are some really seemingly odd traditions that are out there, and I think when we think about things, sometimes it's hard to realize that, you know, it may be odd to us, but maybe it's not odd to people that celebrate this way. And so we're going to kind of try to figure out what the stories are behind some of these traditions. And there's so many unique, different traditions around the world. Tonight we're going to talk about a lot of European traditions that come to the New World, specifically the United States. And we'll talk about things that really relate to a lot of Christmas traditions and traditions that are around this time of year. I apologize if I miss something. I can't cover everything, unfortunately. I know you probably wouldn't want to be here for 3 hours. But there are traditions that I will be missing tonight. I won't be talking about Hanukkah or Kwanzaa or any of those ones that are around this time of year. But we will talk about ones that relate to Christmas and to Yuletide. Feel free to share your own personal remembrances at the end of the program. There's a lot of food. Feel free to eat as much as you'd like, okay? So, we'll start off. So I broke this down into 4 different categories. Flora, which is basically all the plants, all those things that we bring into our homes. Why do we do that? Why are these things important to us? Then we're going to talk about fauna, which is animals, all the creatures and things that are part of the Christmas holiday season. Let's talk about the food. You guys are sampling some of the food right now. Hope you're enjoying it. We'll talk about some of the other weird and odd holiday foods that are out there. And then finally, we'll hit on some of the festivities, some of the traditions, the stories, the things that people really like to partake in the holiday season. So a few things before we start. A few things about wintertime. First of all, the winter solstice is on December 22nd. The winter solstice is the shortest day of the year. In fact, solstice means sun standing still. So you see it's pretty dark at this time of year because the sunlight, the sun is only up for a few hours a day, and it's the beginning of deep winter. We're not really into January where there's a lot of snow and cold. We're just starting out. And so people start to celebrate, justifiably, before winter starts. What they'll do is they have all that harvest food in. They start celebrating the fact that they're starting winter, but they'll make it through. They're facing maybe starvation in the wintertime because of lack of agriculture, at least in prehistoric times. And they also you have all this cattle, especially if you have cows or sheep or anything like that. You might end up slaughtering them and having a big party because obviously you can't eat and you can't feed those animals through the wintertime. So there's a lot of celebrations around this time of year. Specifically, there's a few. Saturnalia, which is celebrated by the Romans. It's kind of this weird festival related to the god Saturn. There's some traditions of Christmas that kind of get tied in there. But specifically, we have a connection with something that's called Yule, or Yuletide. And Yule is a German Scandinavian tradition that they basically are celebrating right around the week of Christmas. And many of the traditions that we think of as Christmas are actually from Yule. Part of it is, have you ever heard the Yule log? It's on TV sometimes. That's part of the celebration. Christmas trees and just evergreens in general, that's part of the celebration. Lots of our foods that we eat are part of that celebration. So we really see a mixing here. You know, Christmas as we see it today is really a combination of folk traditions and religion. And that's usually what ends up happening with a lot of holidays. You get kind of a mix. It's what in the museum or in the history world we'd call a syncretism. And you're basically seeing these traditions mold together. Now, there's really no consensus as to why Christmas is celebrated on the 25th. In fact, no one really knows why it's on the 25th, because it's a few days after the solstice. I suspect there's probably, it was either the Catholic Church or someone else who basically decided that that was just going to be the day. There's really no particular reason why it's on the 25th, but it's celebrated nonetheless. By the way, if anyone ever tells you happy holidays in this time of year, by the way, holiday is just a shortened version of holy day. And when people say happy holidays, it's been around for a long time. In fact, they say happy holidays because around this time of year, you have all of these church traditions that are celebrated along with Christmas. So you have Advent, you have St. Nicholas Day, you have the Feast of St. John, you have Boxing Day, which is Feast of St. Stephen, and then you have the Feast of the Magi, which is called Epiphany. So when someone would say happy holidays, they would say that instead of having to say all of these different particular holidays. So it's actually just a way of shortening that statement. So happy holidays, Christmas, they actually tie in quite well together. So just as a point of note. Now, what I'm going to do too is as we go along, I'm going to talk a little bit about some of the celebrations that I remember as a child and growing up, and maybe you have similar feelings about these things as well. When I think of flora, when I think of plants and things, I think of going to the Christmas tree farm. When I was in junior high, I worked on a Christmas tree farm. In fact, this is the same Christmas tree farm in the picture here. And I remember baling, putting the tree through that thing to get the netting around it. Oh my goodness, talk about a lot of work. You get poked with the pine needles, you get sap all over your clothes. But I just remember this as being a very important part of my life in terms of Christmas traditions. And it's kind of a fun one. You get to go and chop down a Christmas tree. And of course, Christmas trees are really a big portion of the holiday season. For example, you can see in this picture here, these people are celebrating around a Christmas tree. You can see it's lit up and it's celebratory. Christmas trees come from Germany. That's a Germanic tradition. And if you've ever read anything about German or Scandinavian mythology, trees play a huge part in that. The tree of life, the tree that extends to heaven, green, everything is very natural, and in Scandinavian traditions they would be worshiping nature and that sort of thing. And so oftentimes trees, evergreens, boughs of green plants that are brought into your home, it's meant to kind of evoke that there's hope, that there's winter is not going to last forever. And if you live in Germany or Norway or Sweden, winter does last a long time. So they're going to try to make sure that they're bringing hope into their homes. And so they cut down trees to do that. And by the way, the old song, O Tannenbaum, O Tannenbaum, Tannenbaum in German actually means fir tree. It does not mean pine tree, which is interesting. In the United States, we've got plenty of pine trees. And so it's a little bit different. In Germany, they're going to have fir trees in their homes. In America, they're going to have pine trees. Christmas trees, by the way, they're kind of a symbol. In fact, in Christian traditions, they become a symbol of life, of resurrection. In fact, they kind of tell that nativity story along with it. And trees become more and more popular over time. Originally, when the first settlers came to the United States, they were not putting trees in their home. It really wasn't until about midway through the century that you start seeing trees being put up in people's houses. On the left here, this is Victoria and Albert. Queen Victoria's husband, Prince Albert, was from Germany. And of course, when he marries her and he lives in England, he brings a tree along with him. And that becomes very popular. Queen Victoria is a fashion plate in England. People start celebrating with trees in their houses. In the United States, it takes a little bit longer to catch on. This picture right here, this is President Cleveland's tree. And you can see it's pretty small. The White House trees nowadays, they take up entire rooms. Or we think about Rockefeller Center, they take up, it's like a 20-foot tree. They would start off these smaller trees, and tree decorations were kind of interesting. They would start off with, actually I'll show you just a couple pictures here. They would start off with lit candles, which talk about a real fire hazard. You have your tree lit up with lit candles. Not only are you having wax dripping all over the leaves, all over the presents, you could also burn your house down very easily. They put fruit into trees. If you were rich enough to buy oranges and apples, you'd stick them into little pieces of wood and then you'd just pop them in the tree. They would do popcorn strings. We do that today. Some people still do it. Cranberries, a lot of fruit and natural things on your tree. It's not until the 1800s, 1880s about, that people start putting Christmas ornaments on their tree that are made of glass. By the way, the one up there, that's the pickle ornament. Has anyone ever used a pickle ornament on their tree? Yeah, pickle ornaments are, believe it or not, there's a kind of a myth around it. One of the stores in Boston said, "Oh yeah, Germans have been putting pickles on their trees for centuries." That's a total lie. Instead, what they would have been made is that these would have just been any number of different vegetables shapes that they would make. It's very hard to blow glass into these very different ornaments, and so they've changed them into apples and other fruit and cabbages for some reason. I don't know, that's kind of weird. But they would have these on your tree. And of course, the pickle ornament, there's a whole, whoever finds the pickle the first gets to open the first present or gets to, sing the first song. Around the world, there's other different types of decorations. On the left here, this is from the Ukraine, and they actually put spider webs on their trees. Not everybody does this, but some people do. And this goes back to an old folk tradition about a story about a woman who was too poor to give her children presents for Christmas. And so she cries out in the middle of the night to God that says, "Please help me get presents for my kids." And overnight, the spiders weave webs on her tree. And in the morning, they turn to gold and silver. So these children are rich, and they are able to buy presents. But interesting, it almost is like Halloween and Christmas put together. But it runs a full gamut. There's a lot of different decorations. In the Tallman house right now, we've got Christmas cards on trees. We've got feather trees, which are kind of different. But you see different traditions here for the Christmas tree. In addition to Christmas trees, we also use the holly and the ivy, just like that song. The thing about holly and ivy is that they're highly poisonous. And it's interesting, you guys, I had figgy pudding. When they would do figgy puddings, they'd bring them out, they would put a big old sprig of holly in there to make it look festive. Well, holly is very poisonous. It's the berries in there will make you very sick. If you eat the leaves, it'll make you even more sick. It's very dangerous for dogs and cats. Ivy is a vine plant that it's parasitic. It climbs up trees and strangles it. That can cause rashes. Poison ivy, poison oak, same plant. And so why would you put this in your house? Well, ivy and holly, they grow just about anywhere. Anywhere it's a cold climate. You're going to see this in the wintertime. And so tradition states that, they would see this in the woods, and there's a lot of mythology that goes along with this, stories, and they would start putting it in their homes as kind of a neat little centerpiece to this Christmas tradition. And partly because there's nothing else growing. There's no flowers out in the woods. There's nothing else to collect. And so they would put this in their homes, and by people I mean Scandinavians, Germans, as a way to remember that there's hope through this Christmas season. But yeah, it's very dangerous to have it in your home. And we'll talk more about some of the other plants that are inside people's houses. In addition, you have mistletoe, right? Everybody loves mistletoe. By the way, it's interesting, mistletoe mostly has white berries. There's not usually a lot of red berries, even though that's kind of what we always think. And mistletoe, too, is very poisonous as well. Actually, it's more poisonous than holly and ivy. So you have to be really careful not to eat any of this and make sure your dogs and cats don't eat it. So where does the kissing under the mistletoe come about? Well, believe it or not, Christmas at one point in time was a time for playing pranks. It was kind of like, hey, we've done all of our work in the fall time, now it's time to kind of play jokes on people. And this happened quite a bit, and we're not quite sure where the tradition comes from, but they've said that in the early 1800s, people would start hanging these mistletoe, which grow in the wintertime, and obviously it was probably guys that came up with this one, I'm sure. And they would probably hang it over their heads, and then as a girl walked by, they'd give them a peck on the cheek and say, "Oh, mistletoe, it's a tradition." But it's really just an elaborate prank. There's really no reason why you would kiss somebody under there. In the Tallman house, we have what's called a kissing ball. It's the same idea. You're really just trying to sneak a kiss with the person you're sweet on. But it's not. There's really no reason behind this tradition. It's just kind of this silly prank that I'm sure guys would play for the ladies. Now here's our lovely poinsettias. Everybody loves poinsettias. How many have poinsettias in their home right now, or at their church, or wherever they're going? Yeah, poinsettias are everywhere. And by the way, poinsettias, the whole thing about being toxic and that sort of thing, actually, it's a lot less toxic than the other plants I mentioned. You'd have to eat about 30 leaves of this to get a lethal dose, and you couldn't eat more than 2 because it's so bitter. You would probably vomit before that. But where does the poinsettia come from? It comes from Mexico, actually. And the man on the left there, or on the right, sorry, in a different direction. The man on the right there, his name is Joel Poinsett. He was the first ambassador to Mexico in the 1800s. And of course, he wasn't a very good ambassador, but he was a good botanist. He travels to south of Mexico City, what was then Mexico City, and he finds this plant that the Aztecs knew about for centuries. And he says, "Oh, wow, that looks really great." So he takes a couple snippings, takes a little bit out from there, sends it back home, and in about 20 years, people start referring to this plant as a poinsettia. It was the scientific name that they came up with. It's an interesting story just because of the fact that he just liked this plant and said, "Oh yeah, we should just bring it to America, bring it to the United States." And it really takes off around the 1900s. People start realizing this is an easier option to decorate your house. You can put them everywhere. It grows really well inside. But it's certainly not as toxic as those holly and ivy plants that people would decorate their homes with. But interesting story, yeah. Poinsett, that's where you get the name from. And he definitely was a person who really tried to market that. He was trying to be famous, of course. He wanted to be famous, known for something. So this plant bears his name. In addition, we've got the Yule log, that lovely thing you turn on the TV and it's just a big burning log. I think Nick Offerman just did a thing where he sits in front of a TV, basically just watches the Yule log burn. Where does the Yule log come from? Well, it's one of those traditions that's probably steeped in some Germanic folk tradition of bringing a log into your home and letting it burn for however many days. Over time, when Christians start to use this tradition in Scandinavia and Germany, it's traditionally, they cut down the tree and they burn it from Christmas Day all the way to January 5th. So the 12 days of Christmas, that's when it burns. And you don't have to have a huge one. You can actually have a small, tiny one in your house that has a candle on it. Sometimes people will put it inside of a fireplace. And it does have to burn for a long time. So talk about a fire hazard. You've got a gigantic burning log in your hearth. It could burn your house down. But this is a tradition that comes from those Germanic roots. It's bringing nature into your home, which is a lot of what we do with plants. So when you think about pine cones, pine needles, all that sort of stuff that we decorate today, that's where those traditions come from. It comes from those Yuletide traditions. And sometimes when they would cut one down, it would be a big party. They would just they'd go out into the woods, chop a tree down, and then have a big party with plenty of alcohol served, I'm sure, along with this tradition. So it's interesting to have that as part of the Yuletide season. That's where we get Yuletide from. Oh, so in addition of plants, we have all the lovely animals that go along with Christmas. When I think of animal traditions for Christmas time, I think of Living Nativity. The church that I grew up in, we had a Living Nativity we did every year. And one year we decided to have sheep there. And the sheep were very cold, and so they wanted to cuddle with you. And so I know my father and I were out in the pen, and the sheep just wanted to sleep right next to us. We smelled like a sheep all night, but it's kind of fun to see that. And of course, nativities, that's a big part of it. You know, cows and sheep and donkeys, camels. You see a lot of animals around this time of year. And of course, the favorite is the reindeer, right? Otherwise known as a caribou. And reindeer, of course, they live in the Arctic Circle, Norway, Sweden, parts of Canada, United States. There are caribou in a lot of places. And you're probably asking, well, why is Santa with these caribou, with these reindeer? Why did he choose reindeer? Well, reindeer come into the story because of a guy by the name of Clement C. Moore. He writes a story called A Visit from St. Nicholas, and he names 8 reindeer. I don't know why he chose reindeer. He probably thought he was being clever and said, we'll just go with reindeer, that sounds cool. And he comes up with all those great names, you know, Dasher, Dancer, Prancer. Can you name them all for us?
Dasher, Dancer, Prancer.
You can't remember them. Vixen, Comet, Cupid, Donner, and Blitzen. And so he just comes up with these names. There really is no reason for these names. They just sounded cool. By the way, Donner and Blitzen, those come from old German words that mean thunder and lightning. So that's really why it is. He just thought those sounded cool. So that's why we have those names. Now Rudolph, of course, Rudolph was added, I have to get my year straight here. He was added in 1939. Robert L. May comes up with a story, and it's part of a Montgomery Ward ad. They thought it would be really clever to add another reindeer to Santa's retinue, and so they come up with Rudolph. And of course he's got the nose so bright, there's the song, there's the movies now. But all of these reindeers, there's really no reason behind them except for the fact that these are stories that were invented not too long ago. So it's interesting why they chose that. And I'm sure they chose reindeer because it's very Germanic and looks pretty cool, of course, with the antlers. Now this is one of my favorite traditions. This one is from Wales, and this is called the Matty Lloyd. If you look at it, it looks pretty terrifying. It's essentially you get a horse skull and you put it on a pole, and then you cover a sheet with it, and you walk through the town on Christmas Eve or Christmas Eve night, and you sing songs, you tell stories at people's houses, and it's pretty weird, I have to say. But if you're Welsh, this is something that people celebrated quite a bit. It's part of these old Germanic traditions, especially in England, where you have, this is called the Grey Mare, basically. And there's a lot of stories of spectral horses, ghosts, and goblins, and that sort of thing. And so they would go through the town as this is kind of an excuse to have a party in town. And you bring this, well, it is an actual horse skull. You bring it through the town and you would sing a song. There's a whole elaborate tradition of it. You can look on YouTube. There's a lot of really great Matty Lloyd songs that go along with this. But it is kind of interesting. And we're really not sure where the tradition comes from. It's probably pre-Christian or pre-religion related. And there's really no consensus as to why they have this horse. But yeah, it's pretty interesting. I can't imagine what that guy's thinking. Walking like that, he's probably like, why am I doing this? This is interesting. But yeah, it's a Welsh tradition, very, very common in Wales and in parts of England. Here's another one of my favorites. This is the Yule Cat. Yes, believe it or not, the Yule Cat. The Yule Cat, or the Jólakúturinn, which is from Iceland. This was invented right around the turn of the century. There's not much ancient tradition behind this one. And there's been some talk about, well, why is a cat coming out in the middle of the snow? Well, the story goes that it lurks in the snowbanks and eats people who do not receive any new clothes for Christmas. So when people complain about not getting clothes for Christmas, don't complain. You're worried about this cat, right? But the idea was they invented this story so that farmers would finish wool processing during the fall time. So they finish all that wool, they can make it into sweaters. You get a nice piece of clothing for you. You don't have to worry about this. So it's really just one of those things to frighten children. Let's face it. It's one of those things that frighten it. And it's very recent. It's not something that's been around for 200 years. But yeah, if you were working, you would not be eaten by a cat, but if you were not working, you might get eaten by a giant cat. Yeah, it's interesting. I'm interested in why Iceland chose a cat, but very interesting. Okay, so the next one, please don't be scared, is my favorite. This is Krampus. Has anyone ever heard of Krampus before? Did you see the movie that just came out? So Krampus, first of all, if you want to have nightmares, I would Google Krampus. You're gonna be scared. It's very frightening. Krampus is essentially he's the counterpart to St. Nicholas. St. Nicholas, of course, was rewarding children with chocolate and toys and candy. Krampus is the downside. He's kind of the person that if you're a bad kid, Krampus is going to show up and terrify you. So of course this kid who's smoking, Krampus is going to come after him. And of course Krampus, it looks a lot like Satan if you think about it that way. He's got goat hooves, he's got horns, he's got a very long tongue, which is really creepy. And what he would do is obviously this is not real, but Krampus, so if you were a bad kid for Christmas, they might put coal in your stocking. And add insult to injury, Krampus might come with a switch, which is a piece of wood, and whip a child. Usually right in the butt. But Krampus, this is something that is in Austria. I don't know where this tradition comes from, because there's a lot of other Christmas traditions that relate to this, and this is uniquely Central European. You don't see this very often in other places. And believe it or not, it just happened, I think it's December 5th. They have a night in Austria and Hungary, where kids will go to a forest and they will run the gamut of Krampuses. There's like 15, 20 Krampuses with switches, and you have to avoid them. You have to dodge and weave. I'm not making this up. This is really odd. But it's one of those things that frightens children. If you're good, St. Nicholas. If you're bad, Krampus. Not good, right? So obviously you'd want to be a good kid all year round, because he's watching, that's just creepy. So it keeps you on the straight and narrow path. And then two, it's also a good way to frighten your neighbors. Kids would do this too. So a kid might dress up like a Krampus, and they would go to their neighbors, and they would knock on the door, and they'd make scary faces and stuff. And it might scare their neighbors' friends and that sort of thing. So it was also a way to make mischief. But yeah, Krampus, look it up on Google. You will not be disappointed. In addition, we think about food. By the way, this is one of my favorite cookies of all time. These are wreath cookies. They're made with corn flakes and marshmallows and butter. And oh my goodness, are they good. But were they a pain in the neck to make? My poor mother had to make these with minimal help from us children. And they're really good to eat. And I just remember this as being part of our Christmas tradition in my house. And so there is a lot of different foods that people make at this time of year. You've probably already sampled some of them. We'll go through some of them. Of course, everybody's favorite, the fruitcake, right? Oh, the fruitcake. This is a particularly nasty one. Fruitcakes are very common throughout most of Europe. Believe it or not, fruitcake from Ireland or England is going to taste pretty good. Raisins, currants, yeah, that tastes good. This is American. This is American food. Fruitcakes were invented to basically preserve food. You have all these raisins, these currants, these berries and stuff, and you got to get rid of them. You're basically just saying, just throw it in a cake, we'll eat it. Not very good. And of course, Americans have to make it worse by adding candied cherries. I don't know why they added it. I suspect you're trying to save your food from going bad. So candied cherries were often put in sugar and brandied sometimes. Sometimes it's really disgusting. They would add plants like citron and other candied sugar peels. It's not very good. And does anyone here like fruitcake? What do you normally put in your fruitcake? Or what makes it so good for you?
The candied fruit.
The candied fruit? Here I'm making fun of this candied fruit for you. I will say it's not for me, it's for other people, right? So, but yeah, it's a weird thing because it's celebrated almost universally throughout Europe, but you get different types of cakes around. And believe it or not, actually, this comes from the Roman period too. Romans would make cakes of barley and rye, and they would add currants and dates and figs. And it's just a way to kind of to spend the food that you have. And of course, it probably tastes pretty good for someone who's eating kind of bland foods all the time. You might like to have a little fruit in your diet. Just eating oat and other types of bread is going to be hard to stomach. Believe it or not, fruitcakes also had a problem. In the Middle Ages, you couldn't use butter in your fruitcake because the Pope said, butter, sorry, made from an animal, you have to fast on certain days. And so they actually petitioned Pope Innocent VIII to make sure that we could use butter in a fruitcake to make it taste better. And so, yeah, believe it or not, it happens. They actually petitioned the Pope to make the cakes better by adding different ingredients. And you could also, in the United States, you could see mail order fruitcakes in around 1913. And so it just grows over time. But yeah, unfortunately, fruitcakes, they get such a bad rap around the Christmas time. Everybody dreads having to eat one. But there are variations. The Stollen, which is over there, that's pretty good. Yeah, it's more dramatic, so that you're not going to see as much of the candied cherries in there, but you will see some different variation. Of course, the figgy pudding. I love that cat right there holding the figgy pudding. You can see the sprig of holly on top. Holy dangerous to put a sprig of holly in there. But figgy pudding, very popular in England. If you think about Charles Dickens, if you think about that song, now bring us a figgy pudding, now bring us a figgy pudding, and bring it right here, I totally understand why they want to bring it right here. It's really good. It tastes really good. It's a really nice treat. In England, they have plum puddings. They have suet pudding, which is not as good. But these kind of puddings are very common. Usually, they have a glaze on top or a frosting. We used a glaze here tonight. And sometimes they'd actually light them on fire, too. What they would do is pour brandy in the top, light it up, and that was the kind of, yeah, that's the cool part of Christmas. And people look forward to this. If you read A Christmas Carol, there's a whole scene of that, where they light the figgy pudding or some sort of pudding up like that. And it's really pretty good tradition. I think this is something that, as Americans, we should bring back, because it's really good. So, and of course, it's got figs and dates, but you really can't taste it. Not as much as a fig Newton, actually. But yeah, I always wonder, why would they put holly in there? That just seems really dangerous. But very, very Dickensian. Some of them would actually put coins in the cake. Yeah, so the good kid might get a piece of coin in there, but be careful, you might bite down, you might break 2 teeth. Luckily, coins are a little bit softer metals, but they would actually put prizes in the cake as kind of an inducement for Christmas traditions. Of course, we've got, this is an interesting ad. I would think the kid, he's totally dumbfounded. You've got candy canes and chestnuts. Candy canes, by the way, originally, no red and white stripes to them, no peppermint flavoring. It was just a big old white candy stick made of sugar. So thankfully, as it got to the United States, they changed it to make it taste a little bit better. And nowadays, you've got the different flavors, you've got the different styles and varieties. There's some elaborate stories that go along with candy canes. Most of them are invented as kind of an inducement for kids to learn different things. But candy canes were mostly just brought here as a German tradition, and then it morphed into kind of that shepherd's crook shape. I imagine the first person to do it probably was thinking with the nativity in mind, because why would you choose that over a swirl or a S or a square or a circle? I suspect it's probably there's some reason behind that. Chestnuts is another thing. Chestnuts roasting on an open fire. Very popular around the world, actually. Around the Mediterranean, people do chestnuts for Christmas or for any holiday. It's a little problematic in the United States because most of our chestnut trees are no longer with us. And Victorians love chestnuts. They just ate them up like nobody's business. But chestnuts oftentimes in the U.S. is going to taste a little bit different. If you get them today, has anyone ever had chestnuts before? They're okay. Yeah, it's kind of like, I don't know. It's like eating. I don't know, it's like hard corn, I guess. I don't know. It's kind of a weird. It's got a smoky flavor to it, but they would do this as part of a Christmas tradition, and the whole chestnuts pop 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 kind of thing. That's very American. We'd put them in a can or in a roaster over the fire, and the shells would pop out, and that's where you get that song. That song. But chestnuts very common in Italy, in Greece, Spain. a lot of places around the Mediterranean because there's a lot of chestnut trees. And they taste a little bit different here and there. Of course, eggnog, and I'm not personally a fan of eggnog. It's really, of course, eggnog is very common for Europeans. The term nog actually comes from the word noggin, which noggin was actually a cup that you would drink it out of, basically. Very Germanic, eggs, cream, spices, that's pretty much what you got there. And it's very popular in America. In fact, in America, they used rum for a long time. And then they switched to whiskey during the Revolutionary War because you couldn't buy rum because there's all these taxes. And then they switched to bourbon, which it just gets getting more alcohol in there. But you can see a lot of changes there. Believe it or not, there actually is an eggnog riot. Has anyone ever heard of this before? Yes, the eggnog riot. It's happened at the U.S. Military Academy in 1826 over the Christmas holiday. A couple of cadets thought it'd be really cool to bring in eggnog. And by eggnog, I mean booze. And they smuggle in whiskey for a party. They get caught, and 21 court-martials later, this is what happens. In fact, they actually riot at the academy. I suspect they're probably a little intoxicated, but it was something that actually did happen, and they were censured by the U.S. government for that kind of behavior. Another one, this is one of my coworkers taught me about this one. This is called the peppermint pig. Has anyone ever heard of the peppermint pig before? Oh, good. Apparently it's big. It's an East Coast thing. It's in New York. She said it was it's more Catholic, I guess, more Catholic tradition. The pig is a symbol of abundance, fertility in a lot of different cultures, and it's kind of a good luck charm too. And so they would make a pig out of peppermint candy, and then what you would do is you put it in this bag. And by the way, I have one tonight, so we're going to break this pig open. It's right up here. You can see it. We're going to put it in the bag, and then you guys probably will start off